faint gunshots echoed through the blizzard. Eli Harper, a veteran running from his past, found a chaotic scene. An overturned truck, its doors riddled with bullet holes, and a smashed transport kennel. Blood stained the snow, but no one was there. His instincts told him to turn his back, to ignore this deadly trouble. But a faint whimper held him. Under a rock, a puppy was dying. Eli did what he thought was right. He saved the dog and deadbolted his cabin, deciding to forget what he'd seen. He'd made a fatal mistake. He hadn't just saved a life. He had just brought home the only witness and the next target of the men who were coming back. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The wind did not howl, it shrieked. It was a raw, physical presence that clawed at the small cabin, seeking entry with the fury of a starving predator. This was the Adirondacks in deep winter, and the nor'easter that had descended on the mountains was one for the history books. Inside, the wood stove fought a valiant but losing battle against the cold seeping through the floorboards. In the cabin's single room, a man sat bolt upright on a simple cot, the sweat on his skin already turning to ice. Eli Harper was awake. He was always awake at this hour. He was a man in his 40s, but the miles on his soul were far greater. His face, visible in the faint, flickering light of the stove, was a map of sharp angles and shadows, a landscape carved by wind and worry, not softened by time. It was a face that was, by nature, kind, but life had etched deep lines of hardship around his eyes and mouth. His brown hair, longer than regulations had ever allowed, was streaked with silver at the temples and combed back impatiently with his fingers. He was tall, with a lean strength that looked wiry in his thermal shirt and worn flannel, but it was a deceptive, solid strength, honed by years of carrying burdens both physical and mental. A thick, untrimmed beard and mustache, more salt than pepper, covered a jaw that was perpetually clenched, even in sleep. He was a former Army Ranger, and the ghosts of Afghanistan had followed him home to this isolated patch of woods. The nightmare had been the same as always. The smell of diesel and dust. The blinding flash that was not a flash, but the world turning white. The sudden, terrible silence that followed the pressure wave. The shouts, the names of his brothers, called out in the dark. Eli swung his legs off the cot, his bare feet hitting the frigid wood floor. He scrubbed his face, his calloused palms grating against the rough stubble. The nightmare faded, its edges dissolving, but the adrenaline remained, a toxic acid in his gut. He was reaching for the tin mug of water on his nightstand when the other sound came. It was not the storm. The wind was a constant, high-pitched scream, but this was different. It was a drawn-out, metallic shriek, a terrible grinding noise that tore through the fabric of the blizzard. It was followed by the heavy, sickening sound of impact, a deep boom that vibrated through the floorboards and into Eli's bones. He froze. For a terrible second, he was back in the Humvee, the world twisting, metal screaming. No, real. That was real. And then, almost lost in the subsequent gust of wind, he heard it. A faint, sharp pop, and then another. His training, buried under years of intentional isolation, screamed at him. Gunfire. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. His body, his soldier's instincts, screamed, threat, secure, engage. But his mind, the part of him that had sought refuge here, screamed louder, hide. This was why he lived 20 miles from the nearest town. This was why his only neighbor was a retired forest ranger 5 miles down the logging road. He had come here to be left alone, to let the human world burn itself out without him. The sounds were trouble, human trouble, the worst kind. A cold wave of dread washed over Eli. He felt the old, familiar switch flip in his brain, the one that shut him down, that urged him to bar the door and let the world handle its own violent affairs. This was not his fight. He had retired. He had surrendered. He stood motionless for a full minute, the cabin groaning around him. But the silence that followed the crash was worse than the noise had been. It was an unanswered question. With a deep sigh that sounded like defeat, the soldier in him won, just barely. He moved with economical, practiced motions. He pulled on his worn, faded blue jeans, 2 pairs of wool socks, and the same red and navy flannel shirt he had worn for 3 days. He laced up his sturdy, insulated work boots. Finally, he grabbed his old brown leather jacket from the peg by the door. It was cracked and worn, smelling faintly of wood smoke and oil, but it was a second skin, a piece of armor he trusted. He grabbed his heavy flashlight from the shelf, clicked it on, and then, after a moment's hesitation, clicked it off. He would go dark. He unlatched the cabin door, and the storm tried to rip it from his hand. Eli stepped out into the chaos, his head down, pushing into a wall of white. He knew this land. He knew the logging road was about 200 yards north of his cabin. The sound had come from there. The snow was thigh-deep, the wind a physical blow that stole his breath. He moved slowly, his senses on fire. The nightmare was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp reality. He found the road, or what was left of it, and followed the plow markers, nearly invisible in the swirling snow. He found the wreck 50 yards later. It was a dark shape, a monstrous shadow in the white. A late-model pickup truck, black or dark blue, was lying on its roof, upside down, its chassis twisted around a massive pine tree. It had clearly been forced off the road. Eli approached cautiously, his flashlight beam now cutting a weak tunnel through the snow. The engine was dead. Steam rose in hissing plumes from the cracked engine block. This was when the avoidance mechanism kicked in hard. He was 10 feet away when his light caught the driver's side door. It was pierced by several dark, round holes. Bullet holes. Clean, small caliber. His light swept to the truck bed. A large, reinforced transport kennel had been bolted to the bed. The impact had snapped the bolts, and the kennel lay smashed open on the snow several feet away. Eli stopped. He did not move closer. Did not. He could smell gasoline mixing with the scent of pine. This was not an accident. This was an execution, or a kidnapping, or something far worse. It was everything he had come here to escape. A cold wave of profound nothing washed over Eli. He felt the switch flip, the one that shut him down. He was not a soldier anymore. He was not a first responder. He was a ghost, living in a ghost town. He would not look for survivors. He would not call the police, even if his satellite phone worked in this storm. He would go back to his cabin, bar the door, and this night would be swallowed by the snow, just like the truck. This was not his fight. He physically turned his back, the flashlight beam pointing toward his own footprints, toward safety. It was then that he heard it. It was not a human sound. It was not the wind or the settling of the wreck. It was a thin, desperate sound, a high-pitched whimper that was almost stolen by the wind. He stopped, his back still to the truck. He listened. There it was again, a cry of pure, unadulterated misery. It broke through the walls. It bypassed the soldier. It ignored the hermit, and it found the man. Eli turned back, his light sweeping the snow away from the truck toward the sound. He followed it, wading past the wreck, past the smashed kennel. The sound was coming from under a low-hanging spruce bough, weighted down with snow. He dropped to his knees, pushing the branches aside. There, curled into a tight, shivering ball, was a puppy. It was tiny, no more than 8 or 9 weeks old. He thought it was a German shepherd, its coat a dark sable gray, already matted with ice. Its eyes were sealed shut in pain. When Eli's light hit it, the puppy tried to lift its head, but only managed another heartbreaking whimper. Eli saw a shallow but steady trickle of blood coming from a cut on its flank where the smashed kennel might have caught it. It was dying. He looked at the tiny creature, then looked back over his shoulder at the dark, violent shape of the truck. The bullet holes, the smashed lockbox, the human trouble. He looked down at the puppy, the innocent life. The choice was simple. It was the only choice he could make. He would save the animal. He would ignore the rest. Reaching in with his gloved hands, Eli Harper gently scooped up the shivering, bleeding creature. It was impossibly small, fitting into the palms of his hands. The puppy, feeling the first warmth it had known in hours, went limp, letting out a faint sigh. Eli stood up, tucking the small body inside his leather jacket, pressing it against the warmth of his flannel shirt. He turned his back on the wreck, on the bullet holes, on the silent driver, on the mystery of Eric Dawson's final moments. He did not check the cab. He did not look for other survivors. He put his head down, and, protecting the small life huddled against his chest, Eli Harper walked back to his cabin, letting the storm erase his footprints, locking the violence of the human world out, as the solid thud of the deadbolt sliding home. The cabin door slammed shut, the heavy thud of the deadbolt sliding home, sealing Eli Harper off from the world he had just rejected. The storm shrieked in protest, rattling the doorframe, but inside, a new, fragile silence had taken over. Eli stood motionless for a second, the adrenaline from the trek draining away, leaving him shaky. He could feel a tiny, desperate warmth struggling against his chest. The puppy was a small, living ember in the absolute zero of his isolation. He pushed the avoidance down. He ignored the memory of the bullet holes and the dark, inverted shape of the truck. That was the outside. This was the inside. His training took over. A script burned into his muscle memory from a different life, a different war. He was no longer Eli the hermit. He was Harper the medic. "All right, little guy, let's see what we're dealing with," he murmured, his voice a rough, unused tool. He gently unwrapped the puppy from inside his jacket. It was a pathetic, sodden thing, its gray sable fur plastered to its ribs. He laid it on the worn kitchen table under the cabin's single bare bulb. The puppy immediately tried to curl into a ball, its body trembling in violent, uncontrollable spasms. Eli worked with a swift, detached efficiency. He grabbed a stack of old, clean towels, relics of a life before, and began to dry the creature, his large, scarred hands surprisingly gentle. He rubbed vigorously, forcing circulation back into the frozen limbs. He filled a pot with water and set it on the stove, not to boil, but to warm. He pulled his old medic field kit from the bottom of his footlocker, a bag he hadn't opened in years. The contents were pristine. "Triage," he whispered to himself. "Stop the bleeding, treat for shock." The puppy's wound was on its left flank. He carefully trimmed the matted fur away. It was a cut, not a tear, about 3 inches long, deep enough to be serious but not catastrophic. It was almost clean, as if made by sharp metal, perhaps the edge of the broken kennel. The puppy whimpered, a sound like a broken hinge, as the warm water touched the raw flesh. "I know. Hold on. Just hold on," Eli said, his voice calmer now. He cleaned the wound with antiseptic from his kit, his movements precise. The puppy did not struggle, just trembled. It seemed to be observing him with a strange, stoic endurance. While the puppy was wrapped in a warm towel, Eli sterilized a needle and thread. He had stitched men together in the flickering green light of a C-130, in the dusty chaos of a firefight. Stitching a puppy on his kitchen table felt surreal, but his hands were steady. He worked quickly, his brow furrowed in concentration, the deep, kind lines around his eyes softening with purpose. He finished the last suture and covered the work with a clean gauze pad. The puppy's breathing was steadier now, the violent shivering subsiding to a mild tremble. He found a dropper and mixed a little lukewarm water with a dash of condensed milk he kept for his coffee. The puppy was too weak to protest, and Eli gently squeezed the liquid into the side of its mouth. It swallowed. "There you go. That's it." He created a nest of towels in a cardboard box and placed it as close to the wood stove as was safe. He gently laid the puppy inside. Only then, with the immediate mission complete, did Eli look, really look, at the creature he had saved. It was not just a German shepherd, or if it was unlike any he had ever seen. The paws were the first clue. They were massive, comically oversized for its tiny frame, like it was wearing boots too big for it. The head was broad, the muzzle already strong. The puppy, feeling the intense heat from the stove, let out a small sigh and opened its eyes. Eli stopped. He was expecting the soft brown or newborn blue of a normal puppy. These were not normal. The eyes staring back at him were a pale, luminous, impossible shade of amber. They were not the cloudy, unfocused eyes of a simple animal. They were clear and sharp, holding an intelligence that was unsettling, as if it was evaluating him with the same intensity he had given it. He sat in his rickety chair, the leather jacket still on, and watched the box. He did not sleep. He fed the puppy every 2 hours, his mind, for the first time in years, completely focused on a single, tangible task. Keep this life going. He named him Bruno. It was a solid, simple name, a name that felt grounded. The storm broke 2 days later, leaving the world buried in a blinding, pristine white. The truck on the logging road had vanished, swallowed by the drifts. Eli told himself he was glad. But Bruno was not getting better. He was not dying, but the wound was inflamed, and the puppy refused to eat, only taking water from the dropper. Eli recognized the signs of a deep infection setting in. His field kit was not enough. He faced a choice: let nature take its course or break his isolation. He looked at the amber eyes, now dull with fever. "Damn it," he muttered. He wrapped Bruno in every blanket he could spare and put him in the cardboard box on the passenger seat of his old truck. The engine turning over sounded like a cannon shot in the profound silence. The drive to town was a special kind of hell. The roads were barely passable, but the rough ride was not what made Eli's hands clench the wheel. It was the people, the town, the thought of polite questions he could not answer. He pulled up to the only veterinary clinic in a 100-mile radius. Sullivan Veterinary Services. A small, unassuming wooden building on the edge of town. He took a deep breath, grabbed the box, and pushed the door open. A small bell chimed, a sound that felt offensively cheerful. The room smelled of antiseptic, animal fur, and bleach. It was clean, organized, and empty, save for the man behind the counter, reading a thick textbook. Dr. Grant Sullivan looked up. He was a man in his late 60s, with a full head of thick steel-gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore simple wire-rimmed glasses, and his face was weathered, not with the sharp-edged anxiety of Eli's, but with a kind of deep, settled patience. He looked like he had seen a great many things and was no longer surprised by any of them. When his eyes met Eli's, they did not just glance, they assessed. Eli cleared his throat. I found this, in the storm. He's hurt." Grant Sullivan nodded slowly, his gaze taking in Eli from head to toe. The worn leather jacket, the beard, the exhaustion, the way Eli held the box protectively. It was a look Eli knew. He had seen it in the eyes of his own senior medics, his own commanding officers. It was a look that weighed and measured a man in a single second. "Bring him back," Grant said, his voice quiet. Eli followed him into the examination room. He placed the box on the steel table. Grant gently lifted Bruno out, his hands large but incredibly deft. The two men did not speak about the past. They did not need to. Grant, a former Army combat medic himself, recognized the set of Eli's shoulders. He recognized the hypervigilance, the way Eli stood with his back to the wall, the haunted look that never quite left the eyes. He recognized a brother, one who had not found his way home. "Found him by the logging road," Eli offered, the words stiff. Grant nodded, listening to Bruno's heart, his focus entirely on the puppy. "He's a big one, or he will be." He checked the sutures. "Good work, clean stitches." Eli just nodded, the praise making him uncomfortable. Grant's hands moved over the puppy, feeling the bones, the joints. He looked at the massive paws, then at the amber eyes. He frowned. "This isn't a normal German shepherd, Eli," he said quietly, not looking up. "I didn't know his name was Eli," Eli said, caught off guard. Grant finally looked at him. "It's written on the intake form you haven't filled out yet, but I recognized you. You're the ranger who bought the old Miller cabin. I'm Grant." Grant turned back to Bruno, his tone professional again. "This isn't a breed I see often. if it's a breed at all. He was cleaning the puppy's ears when he paused. He tilted Bruno's head toward the light. "Well now," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He's not from around here." He gestured for Eli to come closer. Inside the puppy's left ear, high on the flap, was a small tattoo. It was not a breeder's mark. It was a simple, clean line of blue-black numbers and a single letter. A code. Eli stared at it. The room suddenly felt very cold. That simple tattoo was a link to the truck, to the bullets, to the human trouble he had tried to lock outside. A tense silence filled the room. Eli waited for the questions. "Where exactly did you find him? Did you see the truck? Did you call the police?" Grant Sullivan simply continued his examination. He cleaned the infected wound, administered a powerful antibiotic injection, and redressed the sutures. He turned to Eli, his expression calm, impossible to read. "He's severely malnourished, and he has an infection, but he's strong. This kind of animal is bred for strength." He looked from Eli to the dog, and a silent conversation passed between the two veterans. Grant saw a man trying to save himself by saving something else. He saw the code in the dog's ear. He lived in this county. He had heard rumors of the wreck, of strange vehicles on the logging roads. He put the pieces together, and he made a choice. "I'll have to log him," Grant said, turning to his computer. "Let's see. 1. Shepherd mix. Male. Color. Gray," he typed. "Brought in by Eli Harper. Status. Stray." He paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "No need to mention that tattoo in the state database. It just complicates things, causes paperwork." Eli felt the tension drain from his shoulders. He understood. This was a professional courtesy, a closing of the ranks. Grant was not just keeping a secret, he was actively concealing evidence. He was providing cover. "He'll need these antibiotics twice a day," Grant said, handing Eli a bottle. "And this high-calorie food. Bring him back in 1 week, or sooner if the fever doesn't break." Eli took the supplies. "How much do I owe you?" "We'll settle up next time," Grant said, already turning away to clean his tools. "Just get him warm, Eli. Keep him safe." Eli nodded, unable to find the right words. "Thank you, Grant." As Eli walked out the door, the small bell chiming his exit, he felt something he had. The thaw came, not as a gentle invitation, but as a messy, chaotic retreat. Winter did not surrender the Adirondacks easily. For nearly 3 months, Eli Harper and the small creature he had saved existed in a state of suspended animation, a two-being island in a sea of white. But now the world was cracking open. The sound of dripping water was constant, a percussive clock measuring the slow death of the snowpack. Water trickled from the cabin eaves and ran in new, muddy rivers down the logging road. The air, once sharp and sterile, was now thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves, the scent of a world returning to life, or at least to the messy business of it. Life inside the cabin had changed too. Bruno was no longer the tiny half-frozen thing Eli had stitched together on his kitchen table. The name Bruno, chosen for its solid, grounded sound, now seemed almost ironic. The puppy he had mistaken for a German shepherd was growing at a rate that was both astonishing and unsettling. At what Eli guessed was 4 months old, Bruno was already larger than a full-grown beagle, all gangly legs and massive paws that he hadn't quite figured out how to manage. He moved with a clumsy grace that promised future power. His coat was the most dramatic change. The dark sable-gray puppy fur had fallen out, replaced by a thick, dense pelt that was strikingly different. It was a coat of gray and white, with charcoal tipping along his back and tail, a perfect camouflage for the snow-dappled woods outside. He looked less like a German shepherd and more like something that had walked out of a nature documentary. And he was quiet. Eli, in all the months, had never heard him bark, not once. He didn't bark when Eli dropped a cast-iron skillet, sending a loud clang echoing through the room. He didn't bark at the squirrels that chattered insults from the safety of the pines. When he wanted to go out, He would simply appear at Eli's side and stare, those pale amber eyes holding an unnerving patience. When he was pleased, he would huff, a soft, breathy sound from his nostrils. When he was truly alarmed, a low, almost inaudible rumble would vibrate in his deep chest. Eli found himself talking to the dog, filling the silence. "You're a strange one, Bruno," Eli would murmur, scratching the puppy behind the ears. "Don't even know how to be a dog, do you?" Bruno would just lean his weight against Eli's leg, a solid, warm presence. Their routine had saved Eli. The structured feedings, the twice-daily antibiotic regimen that had finally beaten the infection, the trips to Grant Sullivan's clinic, it had all given Eli a framework. A mission. Grant had been a silent, steady anchor. He had examined Bruno's healing wound, his eyes tracing the rapid growth. "He's thriving, Eli. You've done well." He never asked about the wreck. He never mentioned the tattoo in Bruno's ear again. He just treated the dog, and in doing so, treated the man. But healing is not linear. The structure had kept the worst of the ghosts at bay, but they were never truly gone. They were just waiting. The nightmare came on a damp, moonless night in late March. It was not the usual one. This was worse. This time, Eli was not in the Humvee. He was outside, on foot, in a village that smelled of wood smoke, goat, and something metallic. He was leading his team. He had made a bad call. The intel was wrong. The world dissolved. Not in a single flash, but in a series of sharp, terrible cracks. The air filled with a sound like tearing canvas as bullets ripped through the market stalls. He heard men shout. He heard one of his men, a kid named Peterson, call his name. Not a scream for help, but a sound of simple, terrified surprise. Eli had dived for cover, his own rifle firing, but he was too slow. He saw everything. He felt the failure coiling in his stomach, cold and heavy as lead. He woke up, not to the cabin, but to the ambush. He was not Eli Harper. He was Ranger Harper. He was compromised. His team was down. "Contact right! Contact right!" he roared, or thought he roared. The sound that came out was a strangled gasp. He threw himself off the cot, landing in a combat crouch, his body reacting before his mind. The room was black. The shadows in the corner were not shadows. They were the enemy. The sound of the wind in the chimney was not wind. It was movement. He was being overrun. His heart was a frantic drum, a rhythm of pure, unadulterated panic. His lungs burned. He could smell the cordite, the dust, the coppery scent of blood. His hand shot to the small table beside his cot, his fingers closing around the cold, familiar shape of his pistol. It was a 9mm he had kept from his service, his last resort, the one thing he always knew was there. He brought the weapon up, his arms locking into a perfect, practiced stance. He snapped the safety off. The small click was deafening in the silence. "Where are you?" he hissed into the darkness, his voice a broken rasp. He was scanning, his eyes trying to pierce the black. He was breathing in short, shallow gasps. He was completely lost. A shadow moved. It was low, to his left, by the dying embers of the stove. "I see you," he whispered, his finger tightening on the trigger. He swung the pistol, aligning the sights on the center mass of the shadow. The shadow moved again, stepping out of the deepest dark. It did not charge. It did not hide. It just advanced. Slowly. Eli's mind shrieked at him to fire. Neutralize the threat. The shadow took another step, and the faint red glow from the stove's embers caught the glint of two pale amber eyes. It was Bruno. But Eli's panicked brain did not register Bruno. It registered other. It registered movement. The threat was not behaving as expected, which meant it was a new kind of threat. His finger took up the trigger's slack. Bruno stopped, perhaps 10 feet away. He could see the man. He could smell the sharp, acrid scent of panic sweat, a smell that had likely permeated his first few weeks of life. He could see the object in the man's hand. He did not growl. He did not run. He took another step forward, his head lowered slightly. He was quiet, brave, and utterly confused. "Don't move," Eli commanded, his voice trembling. He was shaking so badly the front sight was a blur. Bruno took another step, and then he did something impossible. He was still a puppy, awkward and gangly, but in this moment he acted with an ancient, instinctive wisdom. He let out a low, soft whine. It was not a sound of fear, but a sound of concern. It was the same sound he made when Eli had accidentally slammed his hand in the wood stove door. When Eli didn't lower the gun, Bruno advanced the last few feet. He did not jump. He did not startle. He walked directly up to Eli, who stood like a statue of stone and terror. Bruno pressed his cold, wet nose against Eli's frozen hand. Then, deliberately, he pushed his head, his solid, growing skull, against Eli's forearm. He didn't just nuzzle it, he shoved it. It was a firm, solid, insistent push. The unexpected, warm physical contact was a shock, as sudden as a bucket of ice water. The iron barrel of the pistol was pushed sideways, pointing harmlessly at the cabin wall. Eli gasped, a real intake of air, not the shallow sips of panic. The action, the sound, the smell of the dog, damp fur and cedar shavings, it all crashed into his fog of war. The smell of cordite vanished, the sounds of gunfire faded. He was in his cabin. It was dark. He was pointing a loaded weapon at his dog. His arm collapsed as if its strings had been cut. The pistol felt impossibly heavy. He let his arm drop to his side, his finger moving off the trigger by pure, shaking instinct. Eli slid down, his back hitting the rough log wall until he was sitting on the floor. The pistol lay forgotten in his lap. He stared at Bruno. Bruno, seeing the threat was over, whined again, softly, and then did what his instincts told him to do. He crawled into his pack leader's lap. He was far too big, a clumsy 100-pound weight of legs and fur, but he settled himself, pressing his body firmly against Eli's chest, and laid his head on Eli's shoulder. Eli sat there, his body rigid, for a full minute. Then the shaking began. It was a deep, bone-rattling tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. He had almost done it. He had almost executed the only living thing on earth that mattered to him. Bruno had saved him, not from an imagined enemy, but from himself. He wrapped one arm around the dog's warm body, pulling him closer. The other hand, the one that had held the gun, he buried deep in the thick gray-white fur of Bruno's neck. "He saved me," Eli whispered into the dark. The words were a revelation. The avoidance mechanism, the thick, numbing wall he had built around himself, did not just crack. It shattered. He had spent months trying to forget the violence that had brought Bruno to him. He had told himself the truck, the bullets, the blood were not his problem. He had locked the door. But the violence had found him anyway. It was inside him. And the only thing that had stood between it and tragedy was this strange, silent, brave creature. A creature that had been in a smashed, bullet-riddled kennel. A creature with a code tattooed in its ear. A creature that someone had hurt, someone had abandoned, someone had created. Eli's shaking slowly subsided, replaced by a cold, sharp, unfamiliar feeling. It was not anger. It was resolve. The switch had been flipped. The hermit was gone. The soldier was back, but his mission had changed. "You saved me," Eli said again, his voice stronger now. He stroked Bruno's head. "Who did this to you, boy? Who were you running from?" He no longer had the luxury of not knowing. The debt had to be paid. His avoidance was a betrayal of the one who had just saved his life. He would not be a hermit. The man who woke the next morning was not the same one who had gone to sleep. The nightmares had not come. Or if they had found the door barred. Eli Harper awoke before dawn, not from terror, but from purpose. The switch that had flipped in his mind the night before, the moment Bruno's solid, warm head had pushed the cold steel of the pistol away, had remained flipped. The oppressive fog of his PTSD had not vanished, but it had been burned back, reduced to a low-lying mist by the hot, clear light of a mission. He moved in the pre-dawn dark, his motions economical and precise. The hesitant, pained shuffle of the hermit was gone, replaced by the crisp, efficient movements of the ranger. He made coffee, the scrape of the metal scoop against the tin sounding loud in the quiet. He checked the action on his rifle, not out of fear, but out of habit. Bruno, still mostly puppy, woke and stretched, yawning with a squeak. He trotted over to Eli, expecting the usual slow morning routine. Instead, he found Eli already dressed, lacing up his heavy-duty work boots. Bruno tilted his head, his pale amber eyes full of questions. Eli looked down at the dog. The gray and white coat was thickening, the massive paws now connected to lanky, powerful legs. He was on his way to becoming a magnificent, strange animal. "You saved my life last night, boy," Eli said, his voice quiet. The admission felt strange, but true. "The least I can do is find out who tried to end yours." He pulled on his old leather jacket, the familiar weight settling on his shoulders like armor. He found a length of rope and fashioned a simple leash. He had no intention of letting Bruno run free today. He tucked the 9mm pistol from the night before into a holster at the small of his back, hidden by the jacket. He was done hiding, he was done avoiding, he was going to war. The walk to the logging road was different this time. The world was emerging. Patches of muddy, brown earth, smelling of rot and renewal, pushed through the retreating snow. The air was warmer, the sky a high, pale blue. When they reached the main logging road, Eli paused. The truck was gone. He should have expected it. In the 2 months he had been holed up, nursing Bruno and himself, the local sheriff's department would have surely found and towed the wreck. A small, irrational part of him was almost disappointed. He had hoped it would just be gone, swallowed by the forest, leaving him in peace. But the police would have left a trace. He found the area easily. The massive pine tree that the truck had struck was scarred, a huge swath of its bark ripped away. The ground was littered with broken glass and small, dark pieces of plastic. A single, torn shred of yellow police tape, tied to a lower branch, flapped listlessly in the breeze. Eli felt a flash of self-loathing. He had hidden in his cabin, a coward, while deputies and tow truck drivers had done their work, just 200 yards from his door. He shook it off. This was not about him. This was about the mission. He tied Bruno's leash to a sturdy sapling, well away from the road. "Stay. You wait here." Bruno whined but sat, his training, or maybe just his nature, making him obedient. Eli turned back to the scene. His eyes were different now. He was not seeing a crash site. He was seeing a kill zone. His ranger training took over, his mind automatically calculating angles of fire, fields of view, and escape routes. The truck had been coming down the road toward the highway. The ruts in the mud showed it had been forced off, not swerved. An ambush. He ignored the obvious debris. He ignored the police tape. He began a slow, methodical sweep of the perimeter, his eyes scanning the ground. He was looking for what didn't belong. He was looking for what the police, in a standard traffic fatality cleanup, would have missed. It took him 10 minutes. His boot nudged something small and metallic, half buried in the mud 20 feet before the crash site. He knelt, his knees cracking. He plucked the object from the dirt and wiped it on his jeans. It was a 9mm shell casing. His blood went cold. This was the pop he had heard through the storm. Not a rifle. A pistol, fired from the side of the road. He found another, 10 feet closer to the impact site, and a third, near where the truck's cab would have been. They had not just forced the truck off the road, they had been shooting as they did it. He stood, piecing it together. A driver, Eric Dawson, likely wounded, fighting the wheel. The truck slams into the tree. The kennel, bolted in the back, snaps loose from the impact. Eli's eyes followed the logical path of the debris, the line of kinetic force. The truck hit the pine. The kennel flew. Where? His gaze landed on the cluster of granite rocks where he had found Bruno. He walked over, his boots sinking into the wet earth. He scanned the area around the rocks, the place where Bruno had whimpered. And then he saw it. Wedged deep in a narrow crevice between two boulders, something black and plastic glinted in the morning light. It was not a rock. It was not a piece of the truck. He knelt again, his fingers probing the cold, narrow space. He had to use his knife to pry it loose. It was a cell phone, a cheap, simple burner phone. The screen was a spiderweb of shattered glass. The case was cracked, but it was otherwise intact, protected by the rocks. It was Eric Dawson's phone. Eli stared at it, his heart hammering a slow, heavy beat. This was it. This was the link. This was the piece of human trouble he had tried so hard to ignore, and now he held it in his hand. He turned it over. The back was loose. He pulled it off. The battery was dislodged, but the SIM card was still seated in its slot. A cold sense of being watched prickled the back of his neck. He stood up slowly, pocketing the phone. He scanned the tree line. Nothing. Just the wind in the pines. "Time to go, Bruno," he called out, his voice sharp. He walked back to the sapling and unclipped the leash. Bruno, happy to be free, nudged his hand. Eli started walking fast, pulling Bruno along, his eyes sweeping the road ahead and behind. They were almost to the turnoff for his cabin when he heard it. It was not a loud sound, but it was wrong. It was the slow, wet crunch of heavy tires on the muddy road, accompanied by the low, expensive rumble of a powerful engine in low gear. It was not a sound of travel. It was the sound of a patrol. "Bruno, heel!" Eli commanded, his voice a harsh whisper. He grabbed the dog's collar and pulled him off the road, disappearing into the dense cover of the forest. He crouched behind a thick pine, his hand on Bruno's back, pressing him down. A vehicle emerged, crawling along the road. Eli's breath caught. It was not a local's battered pickup. It was not a green and white sheriff's cruiser. It was a black late-model SUV. It was immaculate, despite the mud. The windows were tinted so dark they reflected the forest like black mirrors. The SUV drove slowly, precisely. It stopped exactly where Eli had been standing moments before, its occupants invisible. Eli stood perfectly still, his breathing shallow. He was hidden. He was fine. But Bruno was not. The dog, who had been curious, suddenly stiffened. A low, vibrating sound, a sound of deep internal terror, started in his chest. The dog he had seen face down his own panic with impossible courage was now, suddenly, terrified. Bruno began to whine. It was a high-pitched, desperate sound. He tried to pull away, to bolt, to run. He cowered, pressing his body so hard against Eli's legs that Eli almost lost his balance. He was shaking violently, his eyes fixed on the black vehicle. Eli clamped his hand over Bruno's muzzle, his heart pounding. "Quiet," he hissed. But it was too late. The SUV did not move. Its engine idled, a deep, threatening thrum. The occupants, whoever they were, must have heard the sound. Eli could feel the unseen eyes sweeping the woods, scanning the trees, right where he was hiding. An agonizing minute passed. Eli's hand was slick with Bruno's panicked saliva. The dog was trembling so hard it felt like he might collapse. "They see us. They know." Then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the SUV's engine revved once, and it continued its slow crawl down the logging road, disappearing around the bend. Eli did not move for a long time. He waited until the last trace of the engine's sound had been swallowed by the wind. He let go of Bruno's muzzle. The dog was a wreck, still shaking, his tail tucked so far between his legs it had disappeared. Eli looked down at his terrified companion. He looked at the muddy road where the black vehicle had been. He felt the weight of the shattered burner phone in his jacket pocket. He connected the dots, the ambush, the 9mm casings, the burner phone, and now a terrified dog and a black SUV patrolling the scene. The threat was not over. The threat was not history. The threat was here. "It's okay, boy," Eli whispered, but his voice was not comforting. It was hard, cold steel. He pulled the broken phone from his pocket, his knuckles white. "They were looking for this," he said, staring at the phone. He looked down at Bruno, who was just beginning to recover. "Or they were looking for you." He finally understood. The enemy was real, and they were actively hunting. The trail of a lie is a cold one, and Justin Ford had run out of patience. For 3 months, the asset had been a ghost, a write-off, a catastrophic loss attributed to Eric Dawson's incompetence and the fury of a freak winter storm. The official word was that the driver, Eric Dawson, and the asset, Asset G, a prototype of immense value, were both lost, swallowed by the Adirondack wilderness. A multi-million-dollar investment, erased. But Justin Ford had not built his discreet high-stakes enterprise on accepting loss. In a windowless room miles away from the snow-capped mountains, in a place that smelled of stale concrete and ozone, the truth had finally been extracted. Eric Dawson was a ruin. His face was a swollen purple mask. He had been found, not by police, but by Ford's men, crawling from a truck stop 2 states away, trying to sell a stolen watch. "He ambushed me," Eric Dawson rasped, the words bubbling through a broken-toothed mouth. He was tied to a simple steel chair. A man stood in the shadows just outside the pool of harsh white light. Justin Ford was a man of contrasts. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, but his eyes were those of a back-alley brawler. He was calm, his voice measured, but that very calmness was what made men like Eric Dawson soil themselves. "You said that," Ford's voice said, smooth as polished stone. "You were ambushed. The asset was lost. The kennel was destroyed. You were lucky to escape with your life." "I was. I swear, Justin, The problem, Eric," Ford continued, stepping into the light, "is that you did escape, and the men who ambushed you, we found them. They never had the asset. They assumed you had gotten away with it." He stepped closer. "So that leaves one person who is not telling me the full truth." Another man, who had been standing silent by the door, took a half-step forward. This was Cameron Ross. Where Ford was the mind, Ross was the instrument. Ross was tall with a lean, athletic build. He wore a simple, expensive black turtleneck and slacks. His hair was military short, and his face was utterly blank, as if he were waiting for an order to assemble a piece of furniture or break a man's arm. It made no difference to him. "He's lying," Ross said. His voice was flat without accent. "I'm not!" Eric Dawson shrieked, panic breaking through his pain. "It's gone. The crash, the cold. It was a pup. It would have been dead in an hour." Justin Ford raised a hand. Ross stopped. "Eric, one last time," Ford said, his voice almost kind. "You were running. The kennel broke. What did you see?" Dawson's body was shaking, a terrible rattling tremor. The lie had run its course. The truth was all he had left. It was alive," Dawson sobbed. "The kennel smashed open. It was bleeding. It ran. It ran into the trees, into the storm. I swear, Justin, I thought it would die. I just ran. Justin Ford stared at Dawson for a long, cold moment. He had heard what he needed. "It was alive," Ford said, almost to himself. He looked at his enforcer. "Cameron," Ross's eyes snapped to his boss. "He's right about one thing," Ford said. "It was a pup, a very valuable, genetically engineered pup. If it was bleeding and it ran into that storm, it's either dead or someone found it. A pup that wounded in a storm that bad? A local wouldn't just leave it. They'd take it to the only logical place." He looked at Cameron Ross. "You have a new priority. Get a list of every veterinary clinic within a 100-mile radius of that crash site. Start with the closest one. Someone found our asset." Ross nodded once. Clean, efficient. "And the reward?" "Whatever it takes," Ford said, turning his back on the weeping man in the chair. "Find it. I want my property back." The bell over the door of Sullivan Veterinary Services chimed, a bright, cheerful sound that was immediately at odds with the man who had just entered. Dr. Grant Sullivan looked up from his microscope. The clinic was empty, the late morning sun streaming through the clean windows. The man standing on the welcome mat was out of place. This was a town of flannel, worn denim, and mud-caked boots. This man, Cameron Ross, was a creature from a different world. He wore a charcoal gray overcoat that was perfectly tailored. his black shoes polished to a mirror shine despite the muddy parking lot. He was clean-shaven, his short hair precise, and he held a polite, empty smile. "Dr. Grant Sullivan?" Ross asked, his voice smooth and professional. "I am," Grant said, wiping his hands on a towel. He felt an old, familiar prickle on his neck. The man looked like a federal agent, but his eyes were wrong. They were too still. "My name is Cameron Ross. I'm a private investigator working on behalf of a client, a very distressed client." Ross walked to the counter, his movements fluid. "They lost something dear to them in this area about 3 months ago. A family pet." "A pet?" Grant repeated, his face neutral. "Yes, a German shepherd, a rare line, gray and white, very large paws, may have had amber-colored eyes." Ross's smile never wavered, but his gaze was sharp, cataloging every detail of the room. "We have reason to believe it was in a vehicle accident during the big nor'easter back in January. It may have been badly injured." Grant felt his blood turn to ice. He thought of Eli Harper. He thought of the desperate, haunted look in the man's eyes. He thought of the military-grade sutures he had claimed to do himself. He thought of the impossible, amber-eyed puppy that was now, he knew, growing into a magnificent, half-wild thing in that remote cabin. He thought of the unspoken bond between two old soldiers. "That was a bad storm," Grant said, his voice even. "We lost a lot of cattle fences, but I don't recall any lost dogs of that description." Ross's smile tightened by a fraction of a millimeter. "My client is offering a substantial reward, just for information on its whereabouts, or what became of it. No questions asked." Ross reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. He slid it onto the counter. It was thick with cash. "That's $5,000, Ross said, his voice dropping. "Just for your time, Doctor. Just to check your records." Grant looked at the money. He looked at Ross. He saw the polite mask, and beneath it, the cold, efficient threat. This was not a man looking for a lost pet. This was a man repossessing a high-value item. Grant Sullivan, the ex-Army medic, made his decision. He put on his simple country doctor persona, the one he used for nervous pet owners and over-anxious farmers. He turned slowly to his old beige computer monitor. He tapped on the keyboard, the clicks sounding loud in the silent room. "Let's see," he mused, squinting at the screen. "January? February? Lord, all I see here are barn cats with respiratory infections and 2 hunting dogs that got into a fight with a porcupine. No, a shepherd, gray, amber eyes? Nope, nothing like that in my logs." He turned back, his face a mask of polite helpfulness. "Sorry I can't help you, Mr. Ross. $5,000. My goodness, they must really miss that dog." Cameron Ross stared at Grant, his polite smile gone. His eyes were flat, assessing. He knew he was being lied to. Grant knew he knew. A silent, dangerous battle of wills was fought across the laminated countertop. "It is extremely valuable," Ross said, the words now clipped, the politeness gone. "Losing it would create complications. For everyone." The threat was no longer veiled. Grant Sullivan, who had held the line in a field hospital under mortar fire in 1973, did not flinch. He pushed the envelope back across the counter. "I'm sure it is," Grant said, his voice suddenly firm, the country doctor gone. "But like I said, I can't help you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have patients in the back." Ross held Grant's gaze for a long moment. Then, with a sigh that was almost theatrical, he picked up the envelope and slid it back into his coat. "A pity." He pulled out a business card and placed it on the counter. "In case your memory improves." He turned and walked out. The bell chimed, a mocking, cheerful sound. Grant stood there until the sound of Ross's expensive, high-performance engine faded into the distance. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from anger. He walked to the door and flipped the open sign to "closed." He locked the deadbolt. He walked to his desk, sat down, and picked up the receiver of his landline. He dialed the long, complicated number for Eli Harper's satellite phone. In the cabin, the sudden electronic chirp of the satellite phone made Eli Harper jump, his hand dropping to the pistol, now tucked in his waistband. Bruno, who had been sleeping uneasily by the stove, sprang to his feet, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. Eli snatched the phone. "Yeah." "Eli, it's Grant Sullivan." Grant's voice was tight, low, and urgent. All pretense of a social call was gone. "What is it, Grant?" "A man was just in here. City man, dressed to the nines. Name of Cameron Ross." Eli went rigid. He looked at the shattered burner phone on his table. "He was asking about a dog," Grant continued, his words fast. "A German shepherd, gray-white, amber eyes, injured in the storm back in January." A cold dread settled in Eli's stomach. "He offered me $5,000 in cash to check my records, Eli. And when I told him I'd seen nothing, he threatened me. Not overtly, but it was a threat." I think I just saw him," Eli said, his voice a strained whisper. "A black SUV, on the road. Bruno." He was terrified. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "I figured as much. Listen to me, son. This wasn't a worried pet owner. This was a man who gets paid to find things that don't want to be found. He's not the boss, but he's dangerous." Grant paused, and his next words landed like body blows. "I don't know how they—" The click of the satellite phone ending the call was a final, damning sound. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on Eli's old life and a new one beginning. They're here. They know it's alive. Grant Sullivan's words hung in the stale air of the cabin. Eli looked at Bruno. The dog had risen to his feet, the deep, chesty rumble still vibrating in his throat. He had not recovered from the sighting of the black SUV. He was on edge, his amber eyes fixed on the cabin door, a sentinel waiting for the enemy he knew was coming. The avoidance was gone. The fog was gone. Eli Harper, the ranger, was fully in command. "They're not just looking, boy," Eli said, his voice a low rasp. "They're hunting." He moved to the small kitchen table. The shattered burner phone lay there, an ugly piece of plastic that had suddenly become the most important thing in the world. He picked it up and carefully, with his knife's point, prized the back open and slid the tiny SIM card free. He looked at the card, then at the dog. He had to break his isolation again. But this time, it was not to seek help. It was to gather intelligence. He grabbed his leather jacket, checked the pistol at his back, and slipped the SIM card into the watch pocket of his jeans. "You're with me, Bruno," he commanded. "In the truck, now." The drive to town was a tactical operation. Eli's eyes were not on the road. They were on his mirrors. Every dirt road, every turnoff, every passing vehicle was a potential threat. He did not drive fast. He drove with a controlled, steady pace, making himself a hard target to surprise. Bruno sat in the passenger seat, not as a pet, but as a co-pilot, his head on a constant swivel, his body tense. The town of North Creek was small, a single main street that catered mostly to summer hikers and winter skiers. Eli parked his truck 2 blocks away from his destination in the lot of a closed-down diner, choosing a spot where he could observe the street. "You stay, you watch," he ordered Bruno, his voice leaving no room for argument. He left the window cracked, just enough for sound to carry, and locked the doors. He walked down the street, his head on a swivel, his senses raw. He felt exposed, vulnerable. Every black truck, every dark-colored SUV made his heart skip, his hand instinctively dropping to the small of his back. His destination was a small, cluttered shop with a neon sign that had half its letters burned out. It read, "J-Bar RD Ends Data Repair." He pushed the door open, triggering a small, tinny chime. The shop smelled of dust, burnt plastic, and the faint, sweet, sick scent of energy drinks. The walls were covered in the skeletal remains of old computers. Behind a counter piled high with circuit boards and tangled cables sat Jordan Blake. Jordan was a man, or boy, of about 25. He was pale, with a thin, greasy ponytail and the perpetually tired eyes of someone who lives by the light of a monitor. He wore a black hoodie, the hood pulled up, and he was intensely focused on soldering a tiny smoking chip onto a motherboard. He didn't look up. If it's a cracked screen, I'm 2 weeks out. If it's a laptop, I have to see it. If it's a toaster, the answer is no. I need data recovered, Eli said, his voice cutting through the young man's rehearsed speech. Jordan finally looked up, annoyed by the interruption. His eyes took in Eli, the beard, the leather jacket, the raw intensity. He visibly recoiled, sinking a little deeper into his hoodie. Yeah? Data recovery's not magic, man. It's expensive, and I'm busy. Eli reached into his pocket and pulled out the shattered burner phone and the SIM card. He placed them gently on the counter, on the only clean spot available. The phone is gone, Eli said. I know that, but the SIM. I need whatever is on it. Jordan poked the shattered phone with a long, thin screwdriver. This thing looks like it went through a wood chipper. Police evidence? It was my brother's, Eli lied, the story coming to him with a grim, easy fluency. He had an accident, up on the pass. He's gone. I'm just trying to get whatever is left. Photos, messages, anything. The lie was good. It was emotional, simple, and explained both the damaged phone and Eli's own haggard appearance. Jordan's cynical expression softened, just slightly. He had heard variations of this before. He sighed, the sound of a man who would rather be dealing with machines. Look, man, I'm sorry about your brother, but the SIM, if the contacts are fried, it's just a piece of plastic. Recovery starts at $200. Cash, no guarantees, and it's going to take at least an hour for me to even try. I have the cash, Eli said, pulling the wadded bills from his pocket. He hadn't bought anything but essentials in a year. He had plenty. He laid the money on the counter. Jordan looked at the money, then at Eli's desperate, hard eyes. All right, I get it. Give me an hour. Go get a coffee. I'll see what I can pull. Eli did not get a coffee. He went back to his truck, and he sat. He and Bruno waited, two silent sentinels, watching the main street, watching the shop, watching the world that was suddenly closing in. An hour later, he walked back in. The shop was empty. Blake? Eli called out. Back here, Jordan's voice replied, muffled. Eli walked behind the counter, into the cluttered back room. Jordan was hunched over a strange-looking contraption of wires and readers, a laptop screen glowing in the dim light. You're in luck, Jordan said, not turning. He sounded pleased, the thrill of the technical challenge having won him over. SIM was mostly intact. Contacts were clean. He turned in his chair. But, this isn't what you think it is. I hope you're not too disappointed. What is it? Eli asked, his voice tight. It's not photos, no contact list, no call history. It's just fragments, deleted text messages. The operating system just saves bits and pieces. Looks like work, coded messages. He turned the laptop for Eli to see. The screen was a mess of code, but in the recovered data field, Eli saw the words, plain as day. GG Asset Secure. Dawson has the package. Delivery route confirmed. Rendezvous at, and then a long jumbled string of numbers. Gray asset compromised. Repeat, compromised. Ford requires cleanup. All assets liquidated. Gray asset, Eli whispered. He looked at the word Dawson. Eric Dawson, the driver. What are those numbers? Eli asked, pointing to the string. Coordinates, Jordan said, tapping a key. A map popped up on his second monitor. GPS. Looks local. Deep in the state land, north of here. Old logging sector. Nothing out there but trees. Ford, Eli said, his eyes fixed on the word. Who is Ford? Jordan shrugged, his professional curiosity satisfied, and now fading fast. How should I know, man? Look, I got you the data. He scribbled the coordinates onto a sticky note. Here's your coordinates. The rest of this is above my pay grade. Eli took the note. He looked at the screen one last time. Gray asset. Ford. He had a name and he had a location. He didn't go back to the cabin. Grant's warning was too fresh. The black SUV was too real. He drove, pushing his old truck onto the highway and then onto the winding, unpaved state roads. He followed the coordinates. He parked his truck a mile away from the spot, hidden in a thicket of pines. Bruno stayed, his orders the same. Eli moved the last mile on foot. He moved like he had been taught, low and fast, using the trees as cover, his rifle now held at a low ready. He smelled it before he saw it, the overpowering chemical stench of char, old smoke, and bleach. He came to a clearing. It was not nothing but trees. It had been a compound. A high chain-link fence, topped with barbed wire, encircled a 2-acre plot. The fence was partially melted, sagging in places. In the center was the ruin of a long, low metal building. It had been a warehouse, or a kennel. It was now a skeleton of blackened, twisted steel beams. The roof had collapsed inward. This was not an accident. This was a demolition, a cleansing. Deliberate destruction, Eli thought, the tactical phrase for destroying evidence coming to his mind. He slipped through a gap in the fence, his boots crunching on the charred earth. He moved, room by room, through the ghost of the building. He saw the concrete pads, dozens of them, small concrete squares, each with a drain in the center. Kennel runs. He saw the ruins of a training area, a heavy-duty treadmill, melted into a slag of plastic and metal, thick leather tethers burned to cinders, empty, overturned bags of industrial-grade feed. This was a factory, a place built to manufacture, train, and ship high-value assets. He found one last thing, near what must have been the office. In a melted filing cabinet, a single unburned piece of paper had survived. It was a shipping manifest. It listed Asset G for gray, alongside a price that made Eli's blood run cold. He looked at the manifest. He thought of the amber eyes, the code in the ear, the terrified reaction to the SUV. Bruno wasn't a pet. He wasn't even just a dog. He was the gray asset. He was property. He was a product. And the men who had made him, the men who worked for Ford, had just destroyed their own factory and were now methodically tying up every loose end. That included a man named Eric Dawson and a small gray-white puppy who had miraculously survived. Eli stood in the ruins, the charred paper in his hand, a cold, hard resolve settling in his chest. They had come to Grant's. They had been on his road. They were not just hunting a lost dog. They were... The drive back from the burned-out compound was a journey through a different landscape. The trees were the same. The muddy, rutted road was the same. But Eli Harper was not. He had left his cabin that morning as a man seeking answers. He was returning as a soldier who had just seen the enemy's objective. In his jacket pocket, the charred shipping manifest felt heavy as a block of steel. Asset G. Gray Asset. He gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. The image of the melted, industrial-sized kennels, the drains in the concrete pads, the sheer, cold-blooded efficiency of the place. It made his stomach clench. This was not a backwoods operation. This was professional, organized. He glanced at Bruno in the passenger seat. The dog was sitting upright, his body tense, his amber eyes scanning the woods with an alertness that mirrored Eli's own. He was no longer the clumsy, oversized puppy. At nearly 5 months old, he was a lean, muscled, 90-pound shadow, his gray-white coat making him look like a piece of the winter forest that had decided to walk. Bruno was not just a survivor. He was an escapee. Eli had been running from his own war for years. But these men, the men who worked for Ford, they had brought their war to him. They had put a code in his dog's ear, left him for dead, and were now hunting him. They had threatened Grant Sullivan. The avoidance was gone. The numbness was gone. The only thing Eli felt was a cold, clarifying resolve. It was the old, familiar feeling from his ranger days, the quiet, focused calm before a mission went hot. He was no longer a hermit, hiding from his ghosts. He was a protector defending his pack. His cabin was his fortress. This was his territory. He made the final turn off the state highway onto the long, unmarked logging road. He drove slowly, the truck's tires crunching on the gravel. He scanned the tree line, his eyes tracking every shadow. He passed the scar on the pine tree where Eric Dawson's truck had crashed, the place where this had all begun. He continued another mile, the woods growing thicker, darker. Finally, he reached the small, almost invisible turnoff that led to his private track, the last half-mile to his cabin. And his heart stopped. It was parked directly in the center of the narrow track, completely blocking his path. A wall of black steel and tinted glass. The black SUV. They were not just patrolling, they were waiting. Eli brought his truck to a slow, rolling stop about 50 yards from the blockade. He put the truck in park, the sound of the engine idling a low rumble. Beside him, Bruno exploded. It was not the cowering, whimpering terror from the first sighting. This was different. A deep guttural sound, a threatening vibration that came from his very core, filled the cab. His hackles were raised from his skull to his tail, his body rigid, his lips pulling back to show a set of teeth designed for serious work. He was terrified, yes, but he was also ready to fight. "Easy, boy," Eli said, his voice low and calm. His own heart was hammering, but his hands were steady. He put a hand on Bruno's shoulder. "I see him. Stay. In the truck. Watch." Eli turned off his engine. The sudden silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by Bruno's low, continuous growl. He watched. The driver's door of the SUV opened. A man stepped out. It was Cameron Ross, the man Grant had described. He was tall, lean, and wore an expensive charcoal gray overcoat that seemed utterly out of place in the Adirondack mud. He left the door open and stood by it, his arms crossed, his face a blank professional mask. He was the instrument. Then the rear passenger door opened. Justin Ford emerged. He was not a large man, but he moved with an aura of absolute, unhurried authority. He was in his late 40s, his dark hair streaked with silver, perfectly coiffed. He wore a tailored black suit and polished black shoes, which he placed on the muddy ground with visible disdain. He looked at the mud on his sole, and his lip curled. He looked at Eli's truck, his eyes cold and assessing, as if he were looking at an annoying piece of broken-down farm equipment. Eli opened his own door. He stepped out onto the track, the worn leather of his old jacket creaking. He stood tall, his lean, wiry frame unmoving. He did not cross his arms. He did not put his hands in his pockets. He let them hang, loose and ready. The two groups stared at each other across the muddy no-man's land. The only sound was the wind in the pines and the menacing, chest-rattling growl from inside Eli's truck. Justin Ford finally spoke, his voice clear, crisp, and cutting. It was the voice of a man used to rooms going silent when he entered. "Mr. Eli Harper, the retired ranger. Quite the fortress you have here." Eli said nothing. Ford smiled, a thin, humorless expression. He took a few steps forward, Cameron Ross moving in perfect, silent unison, a shadow guarding his flank. "We just paid a visit to your veterinarian friend," Ford said, his voice laced with bored contempt. "Dr. Sullivan, a stubborn old man." Ford stopped, about 20 feet away. Close enough to talk, too far to be a sudden threat. "The old vet lied," Ford said, his smile vanishing. "He told my associate, Mr. Ross, that he hadn't seen any stray dogs. But we are very, very thorough. We ran the local credit card receipts. He bought a lot of specialized, high-calorie puppy food 3 months ago. And you paid him in cash, the only cash transaction he's had all year." The cold, methodical intelligence of it chilled Eli. They had not just hunted, they had done the research. "It's a very valuable animal," Ford continued, his voice hardening. "It is not a pet. It is not a dog. It is an asset, a piece of proprietary, expensive property that was stolen from me by an employee named Eric Dawson." He looked past Eli toward the truck cab, where Bruno was now slamming his body against the passenger side window, the sound of the growl now a frantic, furious roar. "That dog," Ford said, pointing, "is my property. I am here to collect it. Hand it over, and you can return to whatever this is. This ghost life you seem to enjoy." Eli stood unmoving. He let the man's words hang in the air. He thought of the terrified puppy he had stitched together on his table. He thought of the amber eyes, the code in the ear. He thought of the pistol in his hand and the warm, solid head that had pushed it away. Property. The word settled it. Eli's face was a mask of mountain granite, his gaze flat and cold. He was no longer the hermit. He was no longer the haunted veteran. He was the man on the wall. He spoke, his voice quiet but carrying in the cold air. "He's home." The words were simple. They were not a negotiation. They were a statement of fact, a declaration of borders. Justin Ford stared at him. The polite, businesslike mask dropped. For a second, Eli saw the raw, cold anger beneath. Ford had expected a hermit, a broken man he could scare. He had not expected this. Cameron Ross, the enforcer, shifted his weight. He recognized this. He recognized the stance, the tone, the absolute lack of fear. He was looking at a fellow professional, and this had just become complicated. "He's home," Eli repeated, letting the words sink in. Ford's eye twitched. "You are making a catastrophic mistake, Mr. Harper. You have no idea what you are protecting. You have no idea who you are dealing with." Eli let his hand drop to his side, his fingers brushing the cold, charred corner of the manifest in his pocket. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Eli said, his voice as hard as steel. "I've seen what you do. I've seen the facility. I've seen the kennels. And I know about the gray asset." The blood drained from Justin Ford's face. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind stopped. Even Bruno, sensing the shift, went quiet. Eli had not just refused. He had declared himself a witness. He was not just a loose end. He was a threat. Ford's expression changed from anger to a cold, frightening calm. The business transaction was over. This was now a cleanup operation. "A pity?" Ford said softly. "You're a braver man than Dawson, I'll give you that. He, at least, knew when to run." He turned, without another word, and walked back to the SUV. He got into the back seat. Cameron Ross held Eli's gaze for one long, analytical second. It was a look of professional acknowledgement. "See you soon." Ross got into the driver's seat. The black SUV did not turn around. It couldn't. It began to reverse, slowly, its tires churning the mud as it backed its way down the half-mile track to the main logging road. It was a slow, deliberate retreat, a promise. Eli stood there, unmoving, until the last glint of black metal had disappeared. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He walked back to his truck and slid into the driver's seat. Bruno was still vibrating, his eyes wild. Eli reached over and buried his hand in the thick fur of the dog's neck. "It's okay, boy," he whispered, his own hand shaking now that the danger had passed. "It's okay. We're home." He looked at the empty, muddy track. The war had not begun. It had been declared, and the first battle had just been set. The illusion of peace was shattered. The moment the black SUV had disappeared, the quiet, isolated woods of Eli's refuge felt different. They were no longer a sanctuary. They were an operational theater. Eli didn't wait. He didn't sit and brood. The confrontation had confirmed the threat, and the ranger in him, now fully awakened, took complete command. He returned to the cabin not as a hermit seeking shelter, but as a soldier preparing a defensive position. Bruno was a mess. The dog was still shedding the terror of the encounter, pacing the small cabin, his paws clicking on the pine boards, a low, continuous rumble in his chest. "I know, boy," Eli said, his voice a low, steady rumble of his own. "They're coming. Let's get ready." While Bruno acted as a living sensor, Eli Harper transformed his home. The cabin was no longer a home. It was a strong point. He moved with a grim, efficient economy of motion. First, the windows. They were vulnerabilities. He took his heavy woolen blankets, the ones meant for surviving -30-degree nights, and tacked them firmly over the two small windows, plunging the room into a dim, amber twilight lit only by the wood stove. It was not just to block the view in. It was to prevent the glass from spraying inward if they fired. Next, the doors. The front door was solid oak, but the lock was standard. He had no deadbolt. He improvised. He jammed his heavy cast-iron wood stove rack, a heavy, awkward thing, into the floor joists and angled it under the doorknob. It wouldn't stop a battering ram, but it would slow them down. It would make noise. The back door, smaller and weaker, was a greater liability. He shoved his heaviest piece of furniture, the solid maple chest of drawers that held his few clothes, against it. It was a barricade. He cleared his fields of fire. He moved his small table to the center of the room. On it, he placed his primary tool, his hunting rifle. Beside it, he laid 3 full boxes of ammunition. He checked the action on his 9mm pistol, the one he had almost used on Bruno, and seated it firmly in the holster at the small of his back. He sat on a hard-backed wooden chair, his back against the solid log wall, a position where he could see both doors at once. He was a ranger again, waiting for the inevitable contact in the dark. Bruno did not settle. He did not lie down. He paced a small triangle, from the front door to the back door to Eli's chair and back again. He was a tight coil of anxiety and protective instinct. He was Eli's early warning system. "Settle," Eli commanded, his voice quiet. "Save your energy." Bruno stopped pacing, but he did not lie down. He sat at Eli's feet, his body rigid, his head up, his ears twitching, scanning the dark, silent room. The sun went down. The temperature in the cabin dropped. Eli did not light a lamp. He did not add wood to the stove. The glowing embers were enough, and the smoke from the chimney would just be a target indicator, a sign that he was home and awake. He ate a can of cold beans, the metallic scrape of the spoon echoing too loudly in the quiet. He offered a piece of jerky to Bruno, who sniffed it but refused, his focus entirely on the perimeter. The hours passed. 8 o'clock, 9. The silence of the Adirondacks was absolute. It was a thick, heavy blanket that muffled the world. Eli strained his ears, listening past the pounding of his own heart. He heard the wind in the high pines. He heard the faint tick of the cabin's log settling. At 10:17, Bruno's head snapped up. He did not growl. He did not move. He just froze. His ears were locked forward, every muscle in his 90-pound body quivering. He was staring at the front door. Eli's hand went to his pistol. He held his breath. Nothing. No sound of tires. No crunch of boots on the gravel path. No slam of car doors. They were here. They had parked down the road and moved in on foot. They were professionals. The knowledge was a jolt of ice water. Bruno let out a low, almost inaudible whine. He scrambled backward, his claws scraping uselessly on the wood floor as he tried to get behind Eli's chair. "What is it, boy?" Eli whispered, his eyes fixed on the blanket-covered window. "What do you hear?" He strained his own ears. Nothing. And then it began. It did not begin with the sharp crack of a rifle or the splintering of the door. It began with a sound that Eli could not hear. Bruno suddenly yelped. It was a high, thin sound of pure, piercing agony. He dropped to his belly, his body convulsing. He clawed at his own ears, his head whipping back and forth as if he were being physically struck. "Bruno!" Eli was on his feet, his mind racing. What is it? A heart attack? A seizure? The dog scrambled across the floor, crashing into the leg of the table. He was desperate, frantic. He pressed his head against the cold floorboards, whining, a sound of unbearable, agonizing torture. "What is it, boy? What is it?" Eli was terrified, his focus shattering. He knelt, reaching for the dog. And Bruno, in his agony, snapped at him, a flash of teeth and terror. He didn't make contact, but the message was clear. The pain was too great. Eli fell back, his hand stinging from the air, not the bite. He finally understood. It was a sound, a high-frequency, ultrasonic, ghostly emission, an electronic whistle, a weapon aimed not at him, but at his only ally. He strained his ears again, his head tilted. He heard nothing but the panicked, scraping sounds of his dog and the blood roaring in his own ears. This was Ford's psychological warfare. This was Cameron Ross's cleanup. They weren't just here to kill him. They were here to break the asset first. They were using a weaponized memory. Bruno was trapped. The sound was everywhere. He ran to the back door, sniffed at the barricade, and then ran to the front, skidding to a halt. He looked at the door, his body trembling, his amber eyes wide with a pain that was more than just physical. This was not just fear. This was programming. Eli could see the terrible internal war waging within the dog. This sound, this frequency, was something he had been trained to fear, to obey. It was a key turning a lock in his brain, a lock Eli didn't know existed. It was a command. It probably meant pain. It probably meant submission. It was a call from his old masters. The sound seemed to intensify. Bruno let out a long, howling sob of a whine. He took one step toward the front door, then another. He was being called. His training was screaming at him to obey, to go to the source of the pain, to submit. He looked back at Eli, his eyes a desperate plea for help. Eli was frozen. What could he do? He couldn't fight a sound. He couldn't shoot a frequency. The dog took another step toward the door. He was losing. The programming was too deep. And Eli, seeing his only friend being ripped away from him, remembered. He remembered the night of the nightmare, the pistol, the cold steel, the warm, solid head that had pushed it away. He dropped to one knee, opening his arms. He didn't shout. He didn't command. He spoke, his voice cutting through the panic, a beacon of pure, desperate love. "Bruno, come to me." Bruno stopped. He was caught between two worlds, the agonizing, invisible shriek that demanded his obedience and the voice of the man who had given him a home. "Bruno, I'm here. It's okay, boy," Eli said, his voice cracking. "I'm right here. Come to me. You're safe here." Bruno looked at the door, the source of his torment. He looked at Eli, the source of his safety. He saw the man who had stitched his wound. He saw the man who sat by the fire. He saw the man who had yelled in the dark, the man who had held the pistol, and the man who had cried into his fur. He saw his pack. The programming screamed at him to obey the whistle, but the bond screamed louder. With a final defiant yelp that was half bark, half sob, Bruno turned his back on the door. He turned his back on his old masters. He scrambled, half crawling, half running across the floor, and launched himself at Eli. He didn't just hide behind him. He burrowed, crashing into Eli's chest, shoving his head under Eli's arm, pressing his cold nose against Eli's chest, his entire 90-pound body shaking violently. He was not obeying the masters. He was running to his leader. Eli wrapped his arms around the dog, shielding him, holding him tight. He covered Bruno's ears with his hands, a futile but necessary gesture. "It's okay. I've got you," Eli whispered, burying his face in the dog's thick fur. "I've got you. You're home." He held his dog, his friend, his savior. The invisible torture continued, but it had failed. It had lost. Bruno had made his choice. Eli looked up from the dog, his eyes now adjusted to the dark. He stared at the blanket-covered window. The love he felt for the trembling animal in his arms had been forged into something else. It had become a cold, hard, lethal rage. They hadn't just come to take his dog. They had come to break him, and they had failed. Now they would have to deal with him. The agonizing, high-frequency sound did not fade. It was cut. One moment the cabin was filled with Bruno's sonic torture. The next, there was a heavy, deafening silence. Outside, in the midnight dark trees, Cameron Ross lowered the ultrasonic device. He tapped his earpiece. "Sir," he reported, his voice a flat, level whisper. "The psychological deterrent is non-effective. The asset is refusing the conditioning. It's chosen." A burst of static, and then Justin Ford's voice, cold and sharp over the comms. "A pity? He's just an animal, Mr. Ross. He's made a bad decision. Phase 2, full breach." "Two-man team?" Ross asked. "Three," Ford's voice snapped. "You, Cooper, and Niles. Rules of engagement are simple. The hostile, Harper, is to be neutralized. I want my property. Alive, if possible. but I want it." "Understood." Ross turned to the two men standing behind him, two dark-clad shadows against the snow. One was Niles, a thin, quiet man. The other was Dean Cooper. Cooper was the opposite of Ross. Where Ross was a scalpel, Cooper was a hammer. He was a barrel-chested man, his tactical gear straining to contain his bulk. He had been complaining for an hour. "Should have just done this from the start," Dean Cooper grumbled, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He cracked his thick knuckles. "Playing dog-whistle games? It's stupid." "It's effective, usually," Ross said, ignoring the complaint. "The conditioning is absolute. This is an anomaly." "It's an animal," Cooper spat. "I'll handle the animal. You and Niles take the front door. Give me the back window. I'll be on the old man before he even knows we're in." Ross nodded, the plan solid. "Go. 30 seconds. On my mark." Inside the cabin, Eli felt the shift. The sudden cessation of the sound was not a relief. It was a warning. He was still on one knee, his arms wrapped around the trembling, panting dog. Bruno was a wreck, his body shaking in the aftermath of the torture, his hot breath fogging the cold air. "It's over, boy." "It's okay," Eli whispered, but he knew it was a lie. That was the psychological attack. Now came the physical one. He released his grip. "Bruno, watch." The dog seemed to understand. The shaking subsided, replaced by a low, predatory stillness. Eli stood up and grabbed his hunting rifle, the cold steel of familiar, grim comfort. He moved to his planned position, not in front of the door, but beside it, his back against the solid log wall. From here, he could fire on anyone who breached the front. His heavy cast-iron barricade was still in place. His entire being was focused on that door. He was listening for the splintering of wood, the sound of boots on his porch. He was ready for the frontal assault. He did not pay attention to the silence behind him. But Bruno did. The dog did not follow Eli. He did not go to the front door and bark. He stood in the dead center of the dark room, a gray-white shadow, his head low, his body poised. He was a sensor array, his ears pivoting, his nose sampling the air. Eli, focused on the front, didn't notice the dog's subtle shift. Bruno's head snapped to the left. His gaze was fixed, not on the front door, but on the back wall, the wall with the small blanket-covered window, the wall that led to the kitchen area and the barricaded back door. He moved. His paws made absolutely no sound on the plank floor. He was a wisp of smoke, a ghost in the dim, ember-lit room. He stood directly beneath the back window, his head cocked, his body vibrating with a tension that was almost electric. He sniffed the air at the base of the window, and a low, almost silent rumble began deep in his chest. Eli heard a sound, a faint scrape. It came from the front, a boot on the porch gravel. "They're here," he whispered, pressing his back harder against the wall, his rifle coming up. But Bruno knew better. He backed away from the window, looked across the dark room at Eli, and let out a sound. It was not a bark, it was not a growl. It was a deep, guttural, chest-thumping huff. A warning. Eli froze. He had been focused on one threat, and his partner was warning him of another. He glanced over his shoulder. "Bruno, what is—" He saw the dog's silhouette, tensed like a loaded spring, staring at the back window. Flanking attack, Eli thought, the military term for a rear assault flashing through his mind. He was in a fatal funnel. They were coming from both sides. Before he could even begin to turn, the attack came. But it didn't come from the front. A heavy, dark object, the butt of a rifle, smashed against the back window. The sound was a dull, heavy whump as it hit the thick blanket Eli had tacked up. There was a second, more powerful impact. The entire window frame splintered with a sound of tortured, breaking wood. The blanket was ripped down. A dark figure was forcing his way through the opening. It was Dean Cooper. He was a massive man, filling the entire window frame. He had a flashlight mounted on his suppressed pistol, and its bright white beam cut through the darkness, instantly blinding Eli. Cooper saw him. He saw Eli across the room, his rifle pointed the wrong way, his body exposed, caught in the light like a deer. It was a perfect textbook flank. A kill shot. Target! Cooper grunted, bringing his pistol to bear, his finger tightening on the trigger. He never finished the word. Bruno had been waiting. He was not waiting for an order. He was not waiting for the man to get all the way inside. He was waiting for the breach. This was his house. This was his territory. This was his pack. In the split second that Cooper's eyes were on Eli, Bruno moved. It was not a bark. It was not a snarl. It was a silent gray-white blur, a 90-pound missile of pure, concentrated loyalty and muscle. He did not jump for the throat. He did not go for the gun arm. He did exactly what he was built to do. He launched his entire body, aimed directly at the center mass of the man in the window. Bruno hit Dean Cooper with a force that was shocking. The sound was not a snap, but a deep, sickening thud, the sound of a heavy, solid body hitting another. Cooper, a man of over 220 pounds, was poised to climb in. He was balanced on the sill, his weight forward. He was utterly, fatally unprepared for a 100-pound projectile moving at full, explosive speed out. The air exploded from Cooper's lungs in a single, shocked, wet gasp. The impact was absolute. It stopped his forward momentum and reversed it instantly. It was like being hit by a small car. Bruno's head and shoulders drove deep into Cooper's chest and ribs. Cooper was hurled backward, his arms windmilling, ripped from the window frame. Eli, blinded by the light, heard the chaos. He heard the whump of the impact, the choked grunt, and then the heavy, chaotic sound of Cooper's body crashing on the outside. There was a sound of scattering firewood, a clatter of a dropped weapon, and a final, wet, heavy crack as his head connected with the thick log pile stacked directly under the window. Then a profound silence. The flashlight beam was gone, now pointed uselessly at the sky. Bruno landed back on the cabin floor, his claws scraping as he spun to face the broken window. He planted his feet, his chest heaving, his teeth bared, and a low, furious growl finally erupting from his throat. He was daring the next man to try. Eli stood frozen for a half-second, his heart hammering, his eyes stinging from the flashlight. He saw the broken window. He saw the tattered blanket on the floor. He saw Bruno, standing guard, a proud, terrifying, and beautiful shadow. He understood. "Bruno?" he breathed. A panicked, frantic voice suddenly erupted from outside the front door. It was Cameron Ross. "Cooper! Cooper! What's your status? Cooper is down! Man down! Niles, pull back! Pull back!" There was the sound of frantic boots scrambling on the gravel, and then silence again. Eli lowered his rifle, his arms shaking. He looked at the broken window, and then at his dog, the flanking attack, the kill shot. Cooper had been silent, professional. He would have been on Eli in a second, his shot fired before Eli had even registered the threat. But Bruno had been there. He had been silent. He had been watching. He had not just fought. He had thought. He had identified the greater threat, the immediate danger, and he had met it with precise, devastating force. He had not just been a good dog. He had been a soldier. He had guarded the flank. He had saved his partner's life. The silence that followed the crash of Dean Cooper's body was a vacuum, a terrifying, held breath. Then, from the front porch, came the frantic, panicked shouts of Cameron Ross. "Cooper is down! Man down! Niles, pull back!" It was not a retreat. It was chaos. A sudden, sharp crack of a pistol shot ripped through the night, followed by another. The bullets were not aimed. They were suppression. They tore through the thin blanket on the front window, one punching a hole in the cabin's far wall with a heavy, sickening thud. Eli Harper did not flinch. He was no longer the hermit. He was no longer the man paralyzed by his past. He was the man his dog had just saved. "Get down, Bruno," he commanded. He dropped to one knee, bringing his hunting rifle to his shoulder. He did not aim at a man. He aimed at the sound. He fired once. The boom of the high-caliber rifle was deafening inside the small cabin, a massive, concussive roar that was worlds apart from the enemy's suppressed pistol fire. His shot tore through the front door, splintering the heavy oak and sending a spray of wood outward. A man screamed in the darkness, a sound of surprise and pain, not a death knell. "He's got a rifle! Pull back! Get Cooper! Get him!" Ross shrieked. Eli fired again, this time into the ground just off the porch. A warning, a perimeter. The sound of boots scrambling on gravel, the heavy, desperate sound of men dragging a limp, heavy body through the dirt. They were running. The cabin was silent again. But this silence was different. It was the silence of a battlefield after the first volley. Eli's ears rang. The cabin was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the cold, damp air from the broken window. He moved to the window, rifle ready, and peered into the darkness. He saw nothing. He heard nothing. Just the frantic, distant sound of an engine starting and tires spinning uselessly in the mud before finding purchase. They were gone. Eli sagged against the wall, the rifle suddenly heavy. He was breathing hard, not from fear, but from exertion. Bruno, his own adrenaline fading, crept forward. He licked Eli's hand, the one gripping the rifle stock. The dog was trembling, but he was no longer cowering. He stood by the broken window, a low, warning rumble still in his chest, his eyes fixed on the dark woods. "Good boy," Eli whispered, his voice hoarse. "Good boy. You stay and watch." The rest of the night was the longest of Eli's life. He knew they hadn't given up. Ford was still out there. They had retreated to regroup, to wait for dawn, to come back with more firepower. Eli sat in his chair, his back to the wall, his rifle across his lap. He and Bruno waited, two soldiers in a foxhole, sharing the watch. The hours passed. The dim red embers in the stove turned to gray ash. The cold of the deep woods began to seep into the room. Eli's old ghosts came as they always did. The smell of the gunpowder, the adrenaline, the waiting. It was a perfect storm for his PTSD. He felt the old familiar panic, the cold sweat, the urge to run, to hide. But this time, he was not alone. He looked down. Bruno was no longer staring out the window. He had moved and was now lying on Eli's boots, his heavy head resting on Eli's knee. He was not just a sentinel, he was an anchor. Eli put a hand on the dog's head, and the panic receded. He was not the man in the nightmare. He was the man on the porch. He was home. He was safe. Dawn came, not as a color, but as a change in the quality of the darkness. The black turned to a deep bruised purple, and then to a cold, unforgiving gray. And with the gray came the sound of new engines, not the expensive, low rumble of the SUV. This was the sound of heavy V8 engines, multiple vehicles, moving fast up the logging road. Bruno sprang to his feet, the growl returning. "I hear 'em, boy," Eli said, standing up, his joints aching. He moved to the front door, his rifle at a low ready. This was it, the final assault. But then lights flashed through the trees. Not headlights. They were the rhythmic, pulsing flashes of red and blue. Eli froze. A voice, amplified by a loudspeaker, boomed through the forest, a sound so alien it felt like an invasion. "Eli Harper, this is the New York State Police. We have the property surrounded. Come out with your hands empty. Come out now." Eli felt a strange, dizzying wave of relief, followed immediately by a new, sharp stab of fear. He looked at Bruno. He looked at the broken window, the bullet holes in his wall. And he looked at Grant Sullivan's truck, pulling up right behind the lead police cruiser. Grant was here. "He called them," Eli whispered, understanding. Grant, after that call in Chapter 5, had not just waited. He had contacted the state police, not the local sheriff. He had bypassed the risk. "It's okay, boy. Stay back," Eli said to Bruno. He placed his rifle on the table. He undid the strap of his pistol holster and left the gun inside. He walked to the front door, kicked the useless iron rack aside, and stepped out onto his porch, his hands raised, empty. The scene was one of controlled chaos. 3 state police cruisers and 2 unmarked tactical trucks. Troopers in heavy gear were moving through the trees, weapons pointed at the cabin. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a state police jacket, his face hard and professional, stepped forward. He was Officer Shane Miller. "Eli Harper," Miller commanded. "I am," Eli said. "We got a call from a Dr. Sullivan," Miller said, his eyes scanning Eli, the cabin, the bullet holes. "Said you were in fear for your life. Looks like he was right. We intercepted a vehicle leaving this road at high speed. 2 men armed, and another, a mister. Cooper in the back, more dead than alive." Eli just nodded. "We also," Miller said, walking closer, "picked up a Mr. Justin Ford, sitting in a very expensive SUV at the head of the trail, waiting for a status report. He claims he was just lost." "He's the one," Eli said. "He and his men, they came for my dog." Miller frowned. "Your dog?" And then Bruno, unable to be separated from his pack, stepped out of the shadows of the cabin doorway. He stood beside Eli, not growling, not threatening, just present. He was magnificent, terrifying, and utterly silent, his pale amber eyes fixed on the new men. The entire scene stopped. The troopers lowered their weapons, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Holy," one of them whispered. Shane Miller's hand instinctively went to his own sidearm, though he did not draw it. "Mr. Harper," Miller said, his voice dropping, "step away from the animal. That is not a dog." Eli did not move. He placed his hand on Bruno's head. "No," he said. "Sir, I am not asking," Miller said, his professionalism kicking in. "New York state law is crystal clear. That is a wolf hybrid. It is an illegal exotic animal. It must be seized and destroyed." "No," Eli said again, his voice cracking. He stepped slightly, putting himself between Miller and Bruno. "You don't understand. He saved my life." "He's a wild animal, son. You're lucky he hasn't turned on—" "He's not—" A new voice. Grant Sullivan pushed past 2 troopers, his face pale but furious. "Officer Miller," Grant said, extending a hand. "I'm Dr. Grant Sullivan. I'm the one who called. I'm also that animal's veterinarian." Miller looked surprised, but shook his hand. "Doctor, this doesn't change the law." "It does when the law is part of a criminal investigation," Grant said, his words sharp and fast. "That animal officer is not wild. He is Asset G, the gray asset. He is the primary piece of evidence from the illegal trafficking ring you just apprehended." Grant pointed to the cabin. "Ask Mr. Harper for the manifest he found at the compound Ford burned down. That dog is living, breathing evidence. You can't destroy him." Miller was stunned, his mind racing, connecting the dots. He looked from Grant to Eli to the majestic, silent dog. "And," Grant said, pressing the advantage, "he's also something else." He pointed to Eli. "You know who this man is? He's a decorated ranger, multiple tours. He came back from the war with wounds you can't see. He was a ghost officer. He was killing himself, slowly, out here." Grant's voice softened, but his intensity grew. "I am this man's friend, and I'm that dog's doctor. And I am telling you, as a medical professional, that animal is a therapeutic support companion." Miller scoffed. "That's a wolf, doctor. I can't sign off on—" "You can," Grant insisted. "That wolf saved his life tonight. The man who attacked him, Cooper? He didn't just fall. Ask him what happened. That dog protected his partner from a flanking attack. He did what no man could. He's a hero, not a liability." Shane Miller was a good cop. He was a man who saw the world in black and white, but he knew when he was standing in a gray area. He looked at the evidence. The broken, haunted veteran, standing tall for the first time. The bullet-riddled cabin. The captured trafficking ring. And the magnificent animal that had been the catalyst for it all. He sighed, running a hand through his short hair. "This is highly, highly irregular, Doctor." "Then we'll make it regular," Grant said. Miller looked at Eli. He saw the fire in his eyes, the hand that had never left the dog's head. "The district attorney is going to have a field day with this," Miller mused. "The wolf dog and the vet." He shook his head. "All right, here's what we do. I'll file the report. The animal is evidence pending the trial of Justin Ford. It is placed in the custody of its handler, you, Mr. Harper, as he is the only one who can control it. He pointed a finger at Eli. But after that trial, you need to be legal. Dr. Sullivan, you and I will file for an exotic therapeutic animal permit. It's a long shot. It's nearly impossible. But given the circumstances, given your veteran status, we'll make it work. He looked at Eli, his face hard again. But it will come with conditions. Strict conditions. Liability insurance, a 10-foot reinforced fence, muzzle in public. He never leaves this property unsupervised. You understand? Eli looked at Bruno, who looked back, a silent, amber-eyed promise. He looked at Grant, who smiled, exhausted. He looked at Miller, the man who had just given him a chance. Understood, Eli said. His voice was firm. Thank you. The repairs on the cabin took a month. The new 10-foot chain-link fence, enclosing 3 acres of the woods, took 2. The trial of Justin Ford was fast. With Eric Dawson's testimony, the manifest, and the miraculous recovery of Asset G, he was finished. On a cool, late summer evening, Eli Harper sat on his newly repaired porch. He wore his old leather jacket, but it felt different. It was no longer a hermit's armor, but just a jacket. He sipped coffee, his eyes not haunted, not watching the past. They were just watching. The sound of the wind in the pines, the smell of the damp earth. Beside his chair, Bruno lay, no longer a lanky 90-pound puppy, but a 120-pound adult, his gray-white coat thick and beautiful, his head resting on his massive paws. He was asleep, but his ears twitched, always listening. They were safe. They had been 2 broken, lost souls, a man hiding from his past and an animal running from his. But in that small, dark cabin, they had forged something new. The man had been saved by the dog. The dog had been saved by the man. And together, they had finally found a way to stop running and simply be. They were home. Perhaps true healing isn't about forgetting the past, but about finding a new loyalty that gives us the courage to face the present. Eli and Bruno saved each other, proving that family is not just about blood, but about a bond you are willing to fight for. If stories like this, about unbreakable bonds and second chances, touch your heart, please consider sharing them. Your support, your comments, and your subscribes truly allow us to find and tell these tales. Our next story is waiting for you right now on the screen.